I'm so glad you're here. If you've hung in with us, we're waiting to go live on Facebook. I've had some tech issues this morning or this afternoon, this evening, whatever day it is for you. But we're practicing the new StreamYard Instagram live stream. And of course, it didn't work. So we are just doing the phone thing. So I'm sorry if I'm not as bright as I would like to be in a regular microphone. And we're waiting for Facebook to go live as well. So just hang in there, because today we're going to be talking about the Advent story. We're going to be talking about how our story intersects with God's story in a miraculous way. And we're going to use the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary to share how their story changed depending on how they handled what was going on with God's story. So let me just see if we're live on Facebook. I don't see that we're live yet. So Karen, if you can coordinate whether we're live. Oh, hi. So glad we're live. Hi, Lorianne. Thanks for your patience. All right, we are going to get started then. Thank you for your patience. We're going to do the book of Luke. We're going to take a little bit of a slice of the Advent story. This is one of my favorite verses in Luke. And so I just want to start here. In Luke chapter 1, it says this: because of God's tender mercy, the morning light from heaven is about to break upon us, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide us to the path of peace. How many of you would like some light right now? How many of you would like some peace right now? That you need a light because you are sitting in darkness. And some of you might even be sitting in the shadow of death. You know, the Christmas holidays can be a wonderful and a terrible experience for a lot of people. There's so much brokenness, loneliness, sadness, depression right now. And if that's you, I want you to know that we are here, we see you. It's a lonely time of the year. Actually, I'm going to be doing a Facebook Live. I think it's one of me or one of my staff is going to be doing a Facebook Live for our Girls on Conquer and Facebook page, because there's so many women who are in a broken home and broken marriage, and Christmas is an awful day for them. So it's not happy for everybody, but Christmas was meant to be a sign, to be a good news. This is good news. God is about to break upon us, to give light to those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death, and to guide us to the path of peace. You know, we all want peace. If anyone could pick one emotion that you would like to feel more of, it probably wouldn't be more fun or more, it would be more peace. We live in a world of depression and anxiety. There's kids who are just going off the deep end with drugs because their insides are so anxious. They can't calm themselves down. And so God is saying he's breaking into history. So what does this have to do with Advent? Well, this was the story of Advent. This is the story where God was breaking into human history. And 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament, where Israel was like, is God going to show up? Where is the Messiah? Is there ever going to be a Messiah? And so I want to talk about three characters. Today I'm going to talk about Zachariah. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about Elizabeth, same time. Hopefully, we'll get on quicker. And then on Friday morning, I'm going to be talking about Mary. These three people are ordinary people. They're just regular folk, just like you and I. And perhaps Zechariah is the most unusual. First of all, he was a man. And in that culture of patriarchy, he was a well-esteemed man. He was a priest. He was a religious leader from a well-pedigreed tribe of Israel. So you would think that he would have been the one who believed God the most. But that wasn't his story. So let's look at what happened to Zechariah. So when Zechariah was going to work that day, he had a job to do. He was selected of all the priests that day to go into the inner chamber and do the things that they do, the ritual sacrifices that they do. All right. And so Zechariah was supposed to go into the inner chamber. He's described as a righteous man, that he followed the Jewish law. Now, here's the belief that we have. How many of you believe? You know, it's probably not true, but you still believe it, that if you only did it right, if you only followed the rules, if you did everything God wanted you to do, that you wouldn't have heartache, that God would bless you in every way that your heart's desire. But that wasn't true for Zechariah. He had a great job. He had a prestigious position as a priest, and yet he didn't have a child. And we'll talk about Elizabeth's feelings tomorrow. That was probably more heartbreaking for her because that was the status of a woman. How many children could you bear? How many sons could you have? And she had no children. She was already old, past childbearing age. It'd be like me getting pregnant at this point. It's like, oh no, that couldn't possibly be true. And so Zechariah had a heartache, even though he's described as a priest, a member of a priestly order, righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all of God's commandments. Put yourself in those shoes, that you're doing it right, that you're honoring God, that you're doing what God tells you to do to live a life well lived. You're honoring the commandments. You're not lying. You're not stealing. You're not cheating. You're not gossiping. You're doing the things that you're having your devotions every day. You're reading your Bible. And you still don't get the desires of your heart. You don't have a happy marriage. You don't have a husband who cherishes you. You don't have a baby. And so that was Zacharias's burden. How do I trust God? That God is good even when he withholds something good from me. Even when I'm doing everything he wants me to do. Even though he would say I'm doing everything he wants me to do. He's not punishing me. But why isn't he giving me the desires of my heart? So here's Zechariah going into this moment. He was chosen by a lottery system, to go in that day to burn incense. And he'd done that before. This was not a surprise. This was not a big deal day. It was an ordinary work day for Zechariah. And he goes in, and he didn't expect to see what he saw. He saw an angel. Now, for those of us who go to work every day, we wouldn't expect to see an angel either. And when Zechariah saw the angel, he knew exactly what it was because he was shaking. The angel said to him, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah. Don't be afraid. I know this is pretty shocking." I mean, it's such a common story, isn't it, that we tend to not see it in our human eyes anymore. It's like Zachariah's up here, Elizabeth's up here, Mary's up here. But think of them just as normal, ordinary people like you and I. He's going to work and he sees this bright light, this angel who tells him something. So now God's story is about to intersect with Zechariah's story in a very powerful way. But Zechariah has a part to play in this story, and so do you. You see, God's story isn't finished. He's going to intersect with his story, with your story, and he does this all the time. We just don't notice it. It doesn't come in big, shining, bright lights or angels that come to us usually. Usually, it hasn't come to me that way. It usually comes in a word of scripture that I read, all right? But they didn't have scripture like we do. They had the Old Testament, but that was for the priests, and Zechariah knew the scripture. He was a priest. So this angel comes to Zechariah and he says, "Don't be afraid. I've got some good news for you, Zechariah. Elizabeth is going to have a child." So I want you to put yourself in Zechariah's shoes. What would you be feeling? What would you be feeling if you were in that moment? Besides fear, because of course he's going to feel fear. What would you be feeling in that moment? If you were Zechariah, what would you be feeling? What would you be feeling? Put it in the chat. What would you be feeling? Yeah, afraid? Uncertain? The question I want you to ask yourself is, my guess is you'd be feeling scared for sure. That's why the angel said, "Zechariah, don't be afraid." He's acknowledging it. Kim says doubt, disbelief. Yeah. I believe you, but help me with my disbelief. Yeah. So that's exactly what Zechariah felt. He didn't believe the angel. He doubted what he had to say. And so he said to the angel, "How can I know what you're saying is true?" Now, here's an angel. It's sort of like us reading God's word. And God says to us, "I have a plan for your life. Oh God, how can I know this is true? My life is so messed up. It couldn't possibly be anything. Nothing good could come out of what I've done to my life or someone else has done to my life. My life story is over. See, Zachariah was a priest. He was a righteous man, a religious man. He was well educated, and he doubted. He doubted what the angel said was true because he couldn't imagine how God could impregnate Elizabeth from their relationship because they were both old. It wasn't just Elizabeth who was old, he was old too. And if you are older and you live with an older person, even having relations isn't always as easy anymore, right? And so he was like a little dumbfounded, like, how am I going to know this is true? How am I going to know this is true? Now, here's the thing I want you to pay attention to. So when God interacts with us and we interact with God, we're shaping the narrative. We're shaping what happens next. God said, like the uncertainty of our country and the upheaval of uncertainty. And God knows that. And in this moment, Zechariah craved certainty. I want to be certain. I don't want to get my hopes up, God, angel. I don't want to hope for something if I'm not certain. How can I be certain this is true? Now, when we study Elizabeth and Mary later on this week, they had different questions. But Zacharias' question is a question that we all struggle with. But what happened then in the story? See, I think this is where we kind of misunderstand God's will. We think that God's will is a fixed thing and has nothing to do with our response. But Zacharias, his response impacted the story, didn't it? And the angel said, Zacharias, since you don't believe God, I'm going to silence you. You're not going to be allowed to talk. You're not going to be able to say anything. And that wasn't a punishment. It was part of the story for Zechariah to learn something about himself and about God. You see, you don't just silence yourself. He didn't choose to silence himself. He was silenced. He could not speak. And so the angel was demonstrating to Zechariah in that moment, I have power over your body. And if I have power over your body to silence you, don't you think I have power over your body to create sperm, to create a child, to get Elizabeth pregnant? And it's not necessarily the angel who has the power. God has the power. But Zechariah doubted that. And so this was both a gift. I'm showing you, I have the power. Or God has the power. I'm showing you right here, right now. See, you're not going to be able to talk. And it felt like a scolding or a slap, not in a bad way, but in a way, okay, this is going to take a detour here for a moment, for 9 months, until you can come to a place of really trusting me in order for you to be able to raise this child in the way he needs to be raised, to be John the Baptist. And so how many of us get stuck in doubt and unbelief? And because of that, our story doesn't go forward like God. Certainty, we're craving answers now. We're not walking in faith. We're not believing God. And so I believe this Christmas story of Advent is not just to tell us the good news. God is with you. He's come to show you light. But that sometimes when God shows us something, or God brings us something, or God wants to be present with us, because the Emmanuel, God with us, is the good news. God is coming. My second favorite passage of scripture beside this one is the first couple lines in the book of John, where the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He came to show us what God is like. But they didn't even believe him when they saw him in the flesh. The Pharisees didn't believe him. A lot of the people didn't believe him. The religious leaders who were above the Pharisees didn't believe him. The Sadducees, Pontius Pilate didn't believe him. Even when God was right here present with us, there was unbelief, lots of unbelief. Even Judas didn't believe him at the end and turned him in. And so how does that affect your story? How does that affect your story when you don't believe God? I'd love to hear what you're thinking about that. How does that affect your story and the outcome of your story when you stay stuck in unbelief? How did that affect Judas's story? Here was Judas, a chosen disciple, and he didn't believe. And he went and made a terrible choice because of his shame. And he ended his story by taking his life because he believed, again, another lie, that I made a terrible mistake. I can't be redeemed. And that impacted Judas' story. Peter also made a terrible mistake, remember? He betrayed Christ. He said, I'll never do that. And he did. He had a moment of unbelief. And it changed Peter's story. But God wasn't done with Peter even when he made a mistake. God wasn't done with Zachariah, even though he didn't believe. God isn't done with you. And if you're stuck in a story that you don't like, if you're living in a story that you don't like about your life and the way your life is going, what might be different if you believed God? First, if you believed that God loved you, that he loved you. Why would God come to earth to show us what God was like if he didn't love you? What would be different if you believed with your whole heart that God loved you? It tells us in Romans that nothing can separate us from God's love. Do you believe that? Or do you say, well, how do I know that for sure? Just like Zachariah said to the angel, how do I know that for sure? I don't know that for sure. We have to believe. Do you believe that? And how would your story change? How would you feel differently inside if you felt loved by God? If you felt valued by God? How would that change the way you spend your day, spend your time? How would it change the way you think, not only about yourself, but about what purpose you have and what value you have? All that changes just by one shift. And I'm going to believe God loves me and I'm valuable to him versus I'm just garbage and I'm not worth anything. Our beliefs about ourselves, about God, what he's saying to us, or our unbeliefs change our story. And if you're stuck in a bad storyline, understand this. Let me get my handy whiteboard. I didn't know if I'd use it or not. So let me just say this. If you're stuck in a story that you don't like, and we see lots of movies where the main character is stuck in a drama, a story where there's a bad guy, right? And so there's two parts of a story, and this is simplifying it. But there's an internal part, which is what's going on in your head, just like Zachariah inside his doubt, his unbelief. That was his internal story. And then there's the external story, which is the angel telling him what was true, right? Maybe you have an external story like you haven't been able to get a job. And you tell yourself, it's because I'm no good. It's because I can't do anything. No one will ever hire me. I'll never be capable. Or maybe your external story is you're not loved by your husband, that he cheats on you, that he is cruel to you, he's indifferent to you, he's neglectful of you, whatever your external story is about your rotten marriage. And the internal story is, and I'm not worth it. I'm not worth paying attention to. I'm not worth loving. No one's ever really loved me in my whole life. So I'm just damaged goods. I'm not worth loving. What might change, even if this doesn't change, even if this part of your story doesn't change, and you begin to change on the inside? If you're a mom, you probably have seen the movie Frozen, right? So Anna and Elsa had some internal stories, like, I can't let it go. I can't feel my feelings, right? I fall for stupid men like that guy that Anna fell for, right? And when she began to change her internal way of seeing herself, her external story began to change. And so Zacharias is caught between not believing what God is saying and his internal story. And let me just tell you something. The internal story will always win. If you don't believe you can, you won't. If you don't believe you're lovable, somebody might not love you because not everybody loved Jesus. But that doesn't make you unlovable. But you allow people to treat you as if you're worthless because you believe it. So what might be possible learning from Zacharias' life? What might be different internally if you change this part of your story? That I'm going to believe God, that has created me, that the psalmist says I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and that my soul knows it full well. What might be different as you believe that? How might the external story begin to change? We have a group coaching program coming up in January called Change Your Story, Change Your Life, or Empowered to Change. How do you change it? Many of you attended our workshop a couple of weeks ago where we talked about this. And as I was, we've had coaches talk about this all week. We have another Facebook Live tomorrow with one of our coaches. But as I was reading the Advent and just studying and praying for myself this Christmas season, dealing with some of my own stuff, my own internal lies that I believe, of really saying, wow, this story is far more than just about Christmas. It's about life. It's about believing God over our own feelings sometimes. And our own feelings are important. That's why the angel said to Zechariah, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. He's not saying, bad man, Zechariah, you feel afraid. He's not saying that. He's saying, I know you're human. When you see an angel, you're going to feel afraid. Everyone would. But I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to give you good news. Can you believe me? Can you believe God? What would be different just in this moment if you could believe that you were fearfully and wonderfully made? Even if you weren't treated that way by your parents, even if you're not treated that way by your spouse, that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. What would be different about your story? And how might you show up differently if you believe that? I'm going to close with a story on my life. Some of you know me a little bit because you followed me and you know that I grew up in an abusive home. And my mom was not a loving mom. I was just telling my husband yesterday, as I was thinking back over some things in my childhood, I can't remember ever getting a hug from her, ever. I can't remember ever her reading a story to me, ever. So I don't have a lot of those warm, fuzzy mom memories. My most loving mom memory was the day she died, when she apologized. And that's my most loving mom memory. But so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, I remember when I was 20, 21 years old, somewhere around there, I was so angry that my mom wouldn't acknowledge me as a worthwhile person. And she was continuing her verbal abuse. And I remember sitting on the front step of her apartment building when she threw me out and crying my eyes out to God. Who doesn't have a mother who loves her? Why can't my mother love me? That was my question that I got stuck in. And that was my story. I'm an unlovable, unwanted girl. Now, I have more to my story than that, but that was my feeling in the moment, right? And it was really impacting me emotionally. And just like Zachariah, now I didn't see an angel, but I definitely felt the presence of the Lord in that moment. And he said, Leslie, that is not true. That is not true. That's not who you are. This is who you are. You are my daughter. You were created for purpose. You have value. Your mom has her own issues. Now, you have to decide, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe God? Or are you going to believe her? And I would issue the same challenge. Zacharias had a decision to make. Am I going to believe God? And as we learned from Elizabeth and Mary, they had different choices to make, and they made a different choice here. Are you going to believe God? Or are you going to believe your feelings? Are you going to believe your history? Yes, maybe your mother didn't love you, but the Lord says, can a nursing mother forget her baby? Well, she might. She might be a bad mother, he says. He owns that. But I will never forget you. I've engraved you in the palm of my hand. This is the Christmas story, that God loved us so much that he came to earth. Read the book of John, first chapter. He came to show us what God was like. He came to be God in the flesh, to live our experience so that we would have a faithful high priest. And so when you believe that, your story changes. I'm no longer an orphan in an unloved home. I'm no longer seeing myself as an abused child. I have a ministry, I have purpose, I have value. But that didn't come from opportunities. Folks, that came from believing different. And as I began to believe different, I began to live different. And as I began to live different, I began to try new things. And as I began to try new things, my story changed completely from being an orphan, unloved, devalued, to having a ministry and a voice, having people in my life who I care about and who care about me. How do you want your story to change? And maybe it starts this Christmas with believing God. So I'm going to put a link up here. If you're interested in the group that I just talked about, if you need some extra help with that, we've given you lots of tools in the past. We do this for free on Facebook Live. We will be continuing to do this for the next couple of weeks because we want this new year to be better for you than it has been. But if you're stuck and you need a little bit of help to change that narrative inside your head, to change those old scripts, those old tapes that you've been listening to again and again and again, who knows what Zacharias' background was? But in that moment, he didn't fully believe God. He didn't fully believe that God was going to do what he said he could do. And in that moment, the angel silenced him. And that changed Zacharias' story for a bit than it might have been had he believed him. And so we're going to look at Elizabeth tomorrow. We're going to look at Mary on Friday to see how their story happened when they met the same angel. They had the same opportunity. And they chose different. And how did that change their outcome? So if you're interested in joining our group of Empowered to Change, just go to leslievernick.com. It's open. Don't go to open. Just go to www.leslievernick.com/change. And that'll give you all the information about the group. It meets for 6 months. It'll meet every other week with a small group, 15 people, coaches. There's a variety of coaches who run the groups, and we would love to help you move forward in 2024 so that you aren't living in the same storyline of I can't. I'm not loved. I'm unimportant. Because when you live from that place, you don't feel like you have a lot of choices and you don't make a lot of good choices. When you live from a different place internally, you impact and affect your external environment different. And your story goes different. Think of the best novel that you've read, a novel that you love, whatever it is, Little Women, Gladiator, I'm trying to think, I've read so many novels, I'm blank on the names, but American Dirt. I mean, there's some really, really good novels. I just finished Cutting for Stone and just really good novels. There's always bad guys in the story. And there's always someone who got knocked down and somehow has to climb their way back up like the King's Speech. And we want them to overcome their adversity. We want them to learn to think differently about themselves. We want them to become the heroine of the story. We don't want them to stay the victim. And God wants that for you too. He doesn't want you to stay with a victim identity. This is who I am. This is what happened to me. He wants you to move past that and say, I am a daughter of the Most High God, and I have value and purpose. I am his workmanship created for purpose in God's story. Imagine, Zechariah is a priest, but he gets to be in the front row of God's story of bringing the Messiah. That's a pretty powerful position. And if he could have believed it, he probably would have enjoyed that place a whole lot sooner and a whole lot earlier than he eventually did. So I would love to just hang out with you for a minute and answer any questions that you have, either about Empower to Change or about how you might change some of what's going on here. The Bible tells us that we're to be vigilant over our heart and our mind because they do impact the story that we're writing about our life. I remember an Amy Grant song, If These Walls Could Talk. What story would they tell? If the rooms of your walls of your house could talk, what kind of story would they tell? Not necessarily about your marriage, but who you are in your marriage. Not necessarily about your kids, but who you are as a mom, as a person. How do you function? Are you a woman of strength and dignity who can smile at the future unafraid because you believe who God says you are, even in adversity? Or are you someone who feels always angry or depressed or lonely, anxious, don't know how to make friends, feel like your story is worthless or over or not even started because you don't know where to start, you can't get any traction? Then maybe a group like this would be just the thing that you need to start your new year right. All right. Thanks so much for being here. I'm so glad that I got on Instagram. We're trying this new program and it worked. So thank you. And I would love to answer some questions. So if Karen is getting some questions, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, let me get over to that part. If you have questions that you'd like to ask about this, you can ask them on our Facebook page. Remember, this is our public Facebook page. But if you're on Instagram and you'd like to ask a question, just go to leslievernick.com/question/. Go to leslievernick.com/question/. And then we can answer your questions on Instagram as well. All right. So that way you don't have to try to DM me or anything like that. You can just ask the question at leslievernick.com/question/. And I have a tech person in the behind the scenes who's going to rewrite those questions and put them into my computer. So here's a couple of questions that we have. How can I trust God when I've been asking for my husband's conversation? It doesn't happen for years. What do you do? I have to just let go and divorce. How can we know the answer? How long should I wait? I think there's two things that we want to talk about here now. We want to talk about this, which is how long do I put up with this in my marriage? And how is this shaping me? You see, your story is internal and external. So if we think about some of the scandals that have been in the church recently, like the Rabbi Zachariah scandal and the Bill Gothard scandal and the Duggar scandal, everything out here looked like it was perfect, didn't it? Looked like they were, got it all together, men and women of God, they were doing the right thing. Here was a mess. They weren't honest, they weren't trustworthy, they weren't as mature as they portrayed themselves to be out here. Okay. So the real story that is God's story starts here. That's why God exposes our unbelief like he did with Zachariah. He exposed, hey, Zachariah, you're a priest and you're going into the inner chamber and you see an angel and you don't even believe the angel? Whoa, there's a root of unbelief there, even though you've got all these positions out here, right? You're a pastor, you're a Bible teacher, and you're watching porn. There's something going on here, right? So the reason I bring this up for you in this question is you've got two things. You've got this issue of my marriage. How do I want to show up there and how do I want to handle that? And you've got this here, and who do I want to be as a woman in this marriage of being unloved and unable to communicate? Do I want to be bitter and resentful and angry, hard-hearted? Do I want to be stupid and naive and everything is fine and no problem? Or do I want to be wise and prudent and loving and firm with good boundaries? That's up to you. This can be great and you can still be a mess in here. Obviously, we see church leaders all the time who have thriving ministries and are a mess inside. So what we're talking about your story, we're not just talking about out here, oh, let's have a good marriage, but what kind of person are you in the marriage, whether it's good or bad? That's totally up to you. You can't control all of this, right? You can't control whether ministry succeeds all the time. You can't control whether someone likes you all the time or any of those. Jesus didn't get liked by everybody. But what kind of person are you? This is the piece that we neglect. And that's why we're having so much failure in our ministry leaders, because their character and their substance is immature or wicked. And they're stumbling here. And so, or they're faking it here. So I would just ask you to do two things. Where don't I trust God? Where do I need to grow here? Where do I need to learn what I need to learn in this adverse situation? So do I need to learn more patience from my husband? Or maybe I need to learn to have more boundaries and need to learn to speak up, and I need to stop being afraid of conflict and need to learn to manage conflict in a godly way. Maybe those are the things I need to learn to be more of the person God calls me to be in this story, right? So we keep looking for the story to change happily ever after. It may not. Jesus' story didn't end that way. Jesus' story ended on the cross and then the resurrection. Right? So sometimes our stories don't end. Paul was in prison. Stephen got stoned. It's not like the story we promise, oh, if you follow God, that's what Zachariah is. If I follow God, my story should be good. But he wasn't. He didn't have a baby. Right? And so when we're talking about story, we're talking about how do you as the main character want to interact with the situation? Because depending on who you are, you will interact with your life situation differently. So for example, I'll just give you a quick example. So if we put on this external, okay? So if we had a bad traffic jam on our way to our Christmas party or on the way to the airport to go to our families for Christmas, how are we going to show up in that story? We can't change this right now. If we can get around the traffic, do it. But let's say you can't. How are you going to show up? Are you going to show up saying, I don't like the traffic? We're not saying, oh, it's fine, God, whatever you decide. We can say, this is making me mad, God. I'm really unhappy that I can't get to the airport in time, or I'm really unhappy that I'm not going to make my party. Be honest. Zachariah was really afraid, right? We want to be honest with our feelings and then say, okay, if I can't control this, I can't change this, my marriage, the traffic, how do I want to be? Well, I want to be a good driver. I don't want to lose my cool and start acting unbecoming. I don't want to be honking my horn or tailgating people or giving them the finger, whatever other people, road raging, whatever people do when they get upset. That's not who I want to be. But guess what? You get to decide that. You get to decide who you want to be in this external story. And that changes the story. It doesn't change the traffic, but it changes the story, right? So let's just play it out. I'm driving in the car and someone cuts me off and someone is disrespectful or driving too slow and I'm in a hurry and I'm losing my cookies and the kids are watching me and I'm screaming and yelling or I'm crying and hysterical because I'm not going to get to the airport on time. What am I telling everybody about who I am and what my story is right there? I still may not get to the airport. I still may not make my plane. Or do I say, oh, this is so disappointing, and how am I going to calm myself down? And this isn't how I want to be right now. And God, help me to trust you, even though I don't understand why I don't get to go to this party, or I don't get to go home for Christmas. How do I trust you in the moment that I don't like? Well, that's a very different story than the one I did. Same character, same situation, but I show up different as the main character. So I would answer your question that way. How can I trust God? You're saying, just like Zachariah, I don't know if I can trust you if I don't know this is going to be better. What would be different if you could trust God and say, God, there's something for me to learn in this? And how do I learn it? Because as I learn it, I'll know the answer to what to do about this. Right? As I grow in my maturity, then I don't need to be so afraid of what happens here. I'll know the right decision. It's time to end this because it's a fake marriage. It's not a real marriage. We're just both pretending, and I'm not willing to do that anymore. Or as you can speak the truth in love and have good boundaries and show up in a way that's mature and godly and loving with firm boundaries and a good no, maybe that might invite your husband to wake up and mature as well. You don't know. You don't know how that part of your story is going to end, but you're in charge of this part, not all of this part. Does that make sense for your question? I hope it does. I know he loves me, but why do I have to go through repeated hard? So I don't know, to tell you the truth. I don't know why you have to go through repeated hard, but I know why I have to go through repeated hard, because I forget. I forget. When life is easy, I get lazy. When life is all easy and everything is smooth sailing, I get lazy. I get sloppy with my finances. Maybe I don't give as much, or I don't pray as much, or I don't read as much, or I don't, just like, if I was, healthy, I may not, pay attention to my body. When you start to get sick, you say, oh, I better exercise, I better eat healthier, because it causes you to pay more attention, right? And so I'm wondering if God also uses hard to build the muscles that we need for the life calling that we have. So if we just think about weights, so I used to work out with weights in my 30s and 40s, and then I stopped when I started writing books and all that. I just didn't have time for it. And now I'm realizing that I've lost a lot of muscle mass. And at this age, again, you start to worry about that in your body, and it starts to not only sag and your skin is sagging, but you know that your osteoporosis and all that stuff. So I started working out with weights. Well, before, where I used to be able to lift 12-pound weights and do 12-pound things, well, I could barely do 8-pound weights. And so hard weights, nobody builds muscle with doing bicep curls with quarters, right? It's just not, or styrofoam. You need hard to build muscles. You need to run hard. You need to, lift heavier weights, not beyond what you can bear, but you build those muscles. And Romans tells us that hard builds muscles that we need to be the person God calls us to be. If God is calling you to be the gladiator, you're going to have to build some muscles, and building muscles is hard, right? If God calls you to be the warrior, and he does call us to be the conqueror, he's going to call us for some spiritual muscles. And those spiritual muscles of faith and fortitude and perseverance and courage usually come through hard. They don't come through easy. We just don't build muscles in easy. We get a break, and it's nice to have easy. Don't get me wrong, but we don't build muscles in easy. Nobody builds muscles at Disneyland. It's fun and it's fine. But at the gym, you build muscles. And so God thrusts us into gym life, suffering 101 that nobody picks in order for you to build the muscles that you need. Think about it. Think of the story of Joseph. And we told that story at our workshop. Joseph built his muscles in hard. He was an arrogant, snotty little 16-year-old when he got sold into slavery by his brothers because of his arrogance and their jealousy. And in slavery, hard, Joseph built some muscles of character development, fortitude, loyalty, courage. And then when he got betrayed again by Potiphar's wife and lied about, and he got thrown into jail, remember that? Hard again. But he's building more muscles of leadership. He didn't know what his story was going to be. His story, if we look at this chart again, Joseph's story was he was in jail. This was hard. But he built muscles that prepared him for God's story later on. And so I would say to you, he loves you, but why do you go through repeated hard? Is because there's some muscles that you're building. And sin is sin, and this world is ugly, and life is hard. Jesus says so. And so we resist hard, and we think it shouldn't be hard, but Jesus warned us, it is hard. Life is hard. And until we accept that, then we won't arch our back so much. It's like, why do I have to go through hard? Everybody has to go through hard because life is hard. Jesus says, in this world, what? You will have hard, difficult. You will have difficult because the world isn't as it should be. It's unjust. It's unfair. It's oppressive. It's sinful. And so it's going to be hard for most people a lot of the time. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time. And when we can accept that, when we accept that this external life is going to be hard, we're going to be in traffic, we're going to have other issues, people don't like us or don't treat us well, then we can quit fighting that. Like, why is hard? And say, okay, it's hard. Now what do I need to do? Who do I want to be in hard? Who do I want to be in hard? You get to choose. Who do you want to be in hard? Do you want to be the person who cowers under the desk? Or do you want to be the kind of person who shepherds 10, 12, 15 kids into the bathroom of the school when the shooter is shooting all the other kids? You want to be the brave warrior, the courageous person in hard. You don't want to be the person who wigs out in hard, but you've got to build those muscles to be able to do that. All right. How can I turn my husband to love God? You can't. You can't. That's impossible. Right? Even Jesus couldn't turn the Pharisees to love God. So please take that off your plate as your responsibility. So I would say some things you can do is you can be a prayer warrior for him and ask God to turn his heart toward him. And you can also be a good example of what a loving, strong person looks like, not a loving milquetoast pushover person looks like. I think women have been told that that's what they need to do to win their husbands. That's not what a good helpmate does. If you're a good helpmate to someone, whether you're a coach and you're helping them to be a better athlete, or you're a business partner and you're helping someone succeed at someone else, or you're a helpmate in another area, you're calling out their weaknesses and you're shoring up their weaknesses. You're not just indulging them with empty flattery so that their feelings don't get hurt. And that's what women have been taught to do to their husbands. It's just, you're the man and I have so much confidence in you. When they're driving the family straight off the cliff, we're supposed to still say, and I will submit and trust God. No, you say, stop and let me out. You're driving crazy right now. We're supposed to speak the truth in love and have good boundaries and all of those kind of things. Just like if your husband had a black mole growing in the back of his neck that he didn't notice, I hope you would tell him. I hope you would tell him, even if it hurt his feelings, because you care. Because you care, that's what a helpmate does. And so how can I turn my husband to love God? I think you can be as godly as you can be. And if we look at who Jesus was, he wasn't just a wimpy, silent person. He spoke the truth. He told people how it was. He didn't mince words, and he loved them. And that's what your husband can decide he wants more of or he doesn't. And not everybody does. So don't take that on your shoulders. How does Empower to Change differ from CORE? So Empower to Change is our 6-month group coaching program on really deep internal change. CORE is a 3-month program on CORE. So it's got a very specific curriculum, CORE. You work on those 4 steps. I'll be courageously committed to truth. I'll be open to learning new things. I will be responsible for myself and respectful toward others. I will be empathetic, even without enabling. So those 4 things are just the curriculum of CORE, and it's much shorter. Empower to Change goes much deeper into really figuring out why you are stuck in certain areas. What are your triggers? How do you learn to think differently? How do you actually put on and put off what Paul talks about? And then learning those new skills and practicing it in a small group. So it's more intense, it's deeper, and it's more robust. So it's longer. All right. How do we let go when it hurts so much? Yeah. I don't know that there's any magic formula for letting go and dealing with the pain other than just grieving. So if we think about letting go, that's what grieving does. It lets go. When you love someone and they die, or you love something and that dream dies, and you let it go, the grieving is the letting go. See, when you don't let go, you just keep being angry and you keep getting stuck in, why is it this way? And it shouldn't be this way. Even if someone died, we get stuck in like, I can't believe they're gone. I refuse to let that happen. And we memorialize their room and we don't pack up their stuff and let it go. We're just stuck in sad and anger that this happened to us, right? When we really let it go, then we're grieving. We're detaching our emotions from this person in our life, right? So if I had a child who died, all right, the worst thing I can think that could happen to somebody is to have a child die, right? So if you have a child who dies, to make a shrine out of your child's bedroom and keep them alive in your head isn't healthy. So the healthy thing is to let them go, but you don't want to let them go because you didn't want them to die. Right? So it almost feels disloyal to let them go, but that's what grieving is. It's saying goodbye. Like, I will miss you. I will not see you this side of heaven anymore. And that sucks. And I'm crying my eyes out and I'm angry and I'm hurt and I'm sad and I'm accepting that that's true. And as I accept that that's true, instead of resisting, it shouldn't be, why did God do this? It's so unfair. Resisting that, as I'm accepting that, I'm grieving. I'm grieving, and as I'm sobbing, I am letting go of this person, and I'm trying to explain this in a non-psychological way. So when you're attached to someone, right? You're close, whether it's parent-child, husband-wife, parent, adult parent, and when they go, it's like a ripping of you, right? And all of a sudden you have to rebuild your life without them. And so letting them go is the first step of detaching and grieving that. And then the second is taking that energy that you invested in that relationship and in that person and bringing it back to you so that you can reinvest it in other things. Whether, like, for example, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? Her daughter was killed by a drunk driver, a horrible injustice. She had to let her go and say goodbye. And she reinvested this energy in starting the Mothers Against Drunk Driving movement so that other drunk drivers couldn't kill other kids needlessly without any sanctions or punishments, right? And so she used that energy for good, and God used that situation for good. It wasn't a waste. It was a horrible grief, horrible loss. And so I think that's what we do when we let go, is we grieve our losses. We accept that this marriage is dead. This person doesn't love us like we want them to, and we let go. And that takes time. Emotionally, we can psychologically know someone's dead, or we can psychologically know we're divorced, but we're still not emotionally detached. And then when we emotionally detach, then we can begin to reinvest that energy that we put into saving our marriage or into that relationship with our child, and we can put it into something new and purposeful that God may have as the next step of our story. But it's tough. And I think the hardest part of grieving a loss is we're mad and we don't accept that it's true. Like, this shouldn't have happened. A child shouldn't have died. A parent should die before a child. We have all these how life should be, and we're so distraught that life isn't turning out the way we think it should that we can't accept that it is, right? And so so let's just do another story just real quick so we can see how we can change our story, change our life. So we're going to take off traffic here. And for those on Instagram, I hope you can see this as well. So instead of, we're going to put cancer. Okay. Now, have you ever been with someone who had cancer and they were amazing? It was like, oh my gosh, how do you live with this? How do you show up in such an amazing way? How do you die so heroically? They have cancer. How can you? Because they accepted. They accepted, this is my storyline. This is the script I've been given. How am I going to live that script heroically? How am I going to live that script lovingly? How am I going to live that script? Even non-Christians have learned to do that. We think of Michael J. Fox, who has Parkinson's, or Christopher Reeve, who died of, who got horseback riding, Superman, who was paralyzed, and he couldn't change this part of his story. I'm paralyzed now, or I've got Parkinson's. And yet Michael J. Fox writes, I'm a happy man. I'm a lucky man. How? How do you write your story about something you don't want to happen here with strength and courage and dignity and purpose, even if you can't change this? That's what we want to teach you how to do and empower to change. If you can change the external, if you can get chemo and get better, do it. If you can move out of a small house and get a bigger house with financial, responsibility, do it. Don't just be miserable because God just wants me to learn how to handle miserable. But if you can't change the external, if you're in jail like Joseph or Paul says, I've learned to be content. I'm in jail. And guess what? I'm writing all these letters to the churches. He didn't know he was writing half the New Testament, but God knew. He had purpose in being in jail. And so that's how you write your story. You are in the circumstances you are, but you get to decide how you're going to be in those circumstances, whether it's cancer, bad marriage, an icky situation. And how are you going to be that? And again, I'm not saying stay if you can get chemo, if you can get divorced, if you can get safe from an abusive spouse, do it. Do it. That God calls you to steward your life. But if you're in a situation where you don't have those options, how do you live there? If you're living in a concentration camp, like the Jews did in World War II, I've read a lot of stories. You have choices to make. Are you going to live there angry and bitter and steal from your fellow Jews? Or are you going to live there and help one another and be there for one another as best you can in a horrible, horrible place? Well, your story is very different depending on the choices you make, isn't it? And that's what Empowered to Change teaches you how to do. All right. Can you unpack more about realizing we're God's child and how that drives our story, or how that drives how our story goes? I think it makes all the difference on how our story goes, because one of the things that humans need, we kind of want a why, like, why is this happening to me? But God usually doesn't answer why. Job didn't get a why. We knew why. We could see behind the curtain. But let's look at the story of Job. Job lost his 12 children. He lost all of his money, and he lost his health. I mean, who would sign up for that? Nobody. And Job struggled, but he said, I will worship the God. God gives, God takes away. I don't understand. But he said, why, God? Why are you allowing this to happen to me? And Job's friends were saying, well, this is why, Job, because you did something bad and God's going to get you for it. See, you did something bad and that's why this is happening to you. And we know why. So God pulls the curtain back in Job 1. He says, Satan asked to test Job to see if he's really of the faith. Now, is that acceptable to you? It's not to me. It's not okay, God, that you would let Satan toy with me. It's not okay with me. So even if we know why, like, why did God let my kid get cancer? Because this is going to be no, this isn't okay with me. So God doesn't tell us why. downwardly spiraling question. It doesn't give you the answer. Why won't my husband love me? Why did he cheat? There is no rational reason why a person molests a child or all of the things that we have to live with in this culture and this crazy. Why? So that's not the question that we should be asking. So if we recognize, all right, Lord, I don't understand why I'm in this story. Why am I the one to get cancer? Why am I the one to live with a loveless marriage? Why am I the one to have a child who died? I don't know. I don't know. And I don't think you're going to get it why to this side of heaven. The question you need to ask yourself is this. So let's say you have cancer and you're stuck in why. Why am I have a terminal illness. I have pancreatic cancer. I know I'm not going to live long. Those chances are, reality. All right. So you can get caught in why and how's the next 18 months going to go for you? How's your storyline going to play out? You're going to die. We're all going to die, but you happen to know how, right? Unless you get hit by a car, you happen to know that you're going to die of cancer in probably the next year and a half. How does that story go? If you keep asking why me, why this, why now, God, this is so unfair. It's going to go into an icky place for you and for the people who are watching you. But what if instead you ask the question, even though you have cancer and you know it's terminal, what if you ask the question, wow, I've got terminal cancer. I've only got 18 months to live. What matters most now? What matters most now? Well, maybe loving on your kids some, maybe writing that book and finishing it, or the legacy that you want to leave your family, or, having some final words with some people that you want to make amends to, or whatever it is. Well, that's a very different ending to your 18 months, isn't it? Than just being angry and stuck in why. You get to write that if you decide. If you just default, you're just going to live in the circumstances and usually cranky and upset that you're in those circumstances. Why me, God? I shouldn't be here. This isn't fair, right? We all go there. And this is where we need to learn to step back and say, wait a minute, I'm in the middle of a story. Esther, in the book of Esther, she's captured into sex slavery in the king's harem, king's concubine, right? And so now what? Now what? She's stuck there. I'm stuck on Instagram. It looks like my Instagram is, I'm not sure if it's on or off, but I look like I'm frozen here. Anyway, so that's the drama. How are you going to write that part of your story? Esther can't change where she's at, but she got to decide how she was going to be there. So I would say that's where you really need to focus is, God, you've brought me here for a reason. And so what do I need to learn? How do I need to grow? What muscles am I supposed to be building for the next chapter of my story that I don't even know is coming yet? But I want to cooperate with the story. All right. A couple more questions and then we're going to go. I think I'm frozen on Instagram, at least on my phone I'm frozen, so I'm not sure what's happening there. One of my problems is how to respond when my husband is being critical. Like when I share an idea of something I'd like to potentially do to improve my property in the future, and he gives a sharp, no, we're not going to do that. I want to show up respectful, but not shutting myself down, not letting him think it's okay. I'm just not a practical thinker. I don't know what to say to his sharp words. We have a whole section in Power to Change on what to say in those situations, and we actually give you scripts to practice with one another so that you don't get stuck. But here would be a couple things. You don't have to say something right away. So what you could do is you can say, you know what? I hear you, and I'm going to think about that because I do have a response. I just don't know exactly how I want to respond. And whether you say that out loud or you just say that to yourself, and then you go back and you say, how do I want to respond to them? So you might come back and say, there's two things I want to talk about. And I don't know you and your situation, but this is what I would say based on what you said. There's two things I want to talk about. One is my ideas about the property that I would love to talk about. But the second thing is a big pattern in our marriage that I've noticed, that when I have ideas about stuff, like you don't really want to listen, or you just shoot them down right away. Like as if I don't have a brain or I don't get a voice or a choice. And I don't like that. I thought we were a partnership. What's that about? So now you're not talking specific idea, you're talking about the patterns that you've observed. And see if he can hear that. Like, I didn't know I did that. What do you mean? Well, yesterday when I told you about the idea I had for this, you said, no, we're not doing that. As if you get to decide everything. Or last week when I talked about, vacation I want to talk to you, said, no, we're going to the beach. That's final. And like, I didn't get a choice. And when I said I wanted that couch and not that couch, you said, no, we're getting the sectional. And so these are 3 examples in the last 2 months where I don't seem to get a choice or a vote here. And I thought we were doing life together, that I'm not just the slave in the harem, but I'm a partner with you in marriage. Am I misunderstanding how our relationship is supposed to work? See what he says. So, but give yourself some time to think through it and how you want to confront both, hey, I want to give my input on this property stuff. And the bigger pattern is you don't seem to want to hear my point of view on anything. And I would give specific examples of what that is. We're always looking for the pattern. So if it's just one time he's cranky, let it go. I mean, I think we're supposed to be forbearing, and people say things that, they're just cranky. But if it's a pattern where he's squashing your ideas or squashing your voice or not giving you a vote on how things are done as a family, then I think those are the things that you want to go back and say, this is a pattern here that I've noticed, and I need to talk about it because I don't want to feel resentful toward you. And then bring it up. Okay. All right. I'm divorcing my husband who refuses to end an affair. He wants both his mistress. It appears as if the rest. So what do you want? All right. He wants his mistress. Hold on. I'm going to turn this live off because I'm frozen, and I'm going to end now on Instagram. So just let me stop that. So he wants his mistress and he wants that. So what immature person wouldn't want their candy and their cake? They want it all. So it's not about what he wants right now. It's about what you want. So what do you want? You get to decide. You can just say, well, you may want that, but that's not going to work for me because I don't want to be married to a man who wants that. All right? You get to decide. So ladies, quit trying to change his mind. You make up your mind. I'm not living like that. I don't want to live with a man who wants to watch porn. If that's what you want to do, got it. I don't want to live that way. It's up to you to decide your story. He might decide his. I like having a mistress and a wife. A lot of men have them, and a lot of people in the Bible had them, concubines and all the rest of the stuff. You can decide, no, I'm not doing that. And you get to. You get to. God gives you the ability to choose. Choose wisely. Is it wise for you to accept someone's sinful foolishness? No, especially when it impacts you. So you get to decide. No. If that's what you want, thanks for telling me, but I'm not living that way. So now what do you want to do? And see what he thinks when you're not willing to put up with it. You see, his life affects your life. And you don't have to put up with his foolishness just because he's the man. There has been something my husband has been accused of. I believe the person who made the accusation, but my husband passed a lie detector test. I've been praying for God to show me the truth. How do I trust what I think God is telling me? Yeah, that's a hard one. So I don't know. Some people are good at passing lie detector tests because they are shrewd that way and clever that way and can manage their body, especially if they've been trained in some of the techniques of managing their blood pressure, and if they're like a Navy SEAL, something like that. So I would just say to the Lord, you really need to know that God would really show you in spades what's true, because God cares about what's true, and he cares about your life, and he cares about your husband's life. And so if there's something that you need to know, I love the prayer in the book of Daniel, when Daniel prays and he said, Lord, you know everything, and show us what we need to know. So I would just kind of go to that prayer in Daniel. I think it's Daniel 2. You know everything, God. And so you show me what I need to know. And I think that when we really pray that, God does show up if we need to know something. And there may be other means of finding things out too, depending on whether it's pornography or whatever it might be. But I think that, just really praying that the truth sets you free. And you need to know the truth so that you know what to do about your marriage and this person that you're married to. Okay. Do you think that some don't want to let go because you feel like you've lost them forever? Not mad, but devastated. I think so, but I think this exposes something in you. Okay, so if you are so dependent on another person for your life that you're devastated at their absence, then what does that say about you? Right? So I think that's where God is trying to say to you, hey, you're putting way too many eggs in this person's basket. They're your God. They're your God. You see, God says, I don't want you to be a man-centered woman, a husband-centered woman. That's idolatry. I want you to be a God-centered woman. And when you're a God-centered woman, you can be brokenhearted when someone doesn't love you like you wish they would, or your husband leaves you or finds another woman or whatever it is. You can be brokenhearted and hurt hard. It's not a light thing to take. But your very well-being and self-worth is not dependent on this man's evaluation of you because he picked someone else. Obviously, he didn't think very highly of you, right? So he picked someone else. Does that mean you're worthless? Well, it depends on how much power you give him to define you, right? And so that's why I think it's so important for God to define you, not another human being, because they're fallible too, and they're broken too, and they're sinful too. And so why would you give them that much power to devastate you? So I think it exposes, that verse, and I'm shooting off the top of my head right now, but in verse chapter 3 of Genesis, after the fall of Adam and Eve, he said, your desire shall be for your husband and he shall rule over you. And I think that illustrates not how God wanted marriage to be, but how the default of our sinful natures created marriage to be. And that is the two issues are, I'm going to want my husband to love me so much, he's going to become my God. Your desire shall be for your husband instead of for me. And he shall control and dominate you instead of respect and love you. And I think when we look at marriage issues and marriage problems, those are the two biggies. Right? And so if you are devastated with a big capital D by the loss of another person, then perhaps you've put your well-being in their hands instead of your own hands and in God's hands. Right? So if I've been married a long time, if my husband dies, I'm going to be really sad, but I'm going to make it. If he left me for another woman, I'm going to be really angry, and I'm going to make it. And I think for a woman to have that kind of confidence that you're going to make it through, that my total worth and well-being is not dependent on someone else who's human to love or value me. I learned that lesson from my mom, so gave that up early, but maybe you didn't yet. I learned it in that stoop when I was crying my eyes out, right? That I couldn't put my entire well-being in the hands of one fallible, sinful human being. And maybe you shouldn't either, even if he is your husband or your mother. All right? All right, that's the end of tonight. That's the end of our questions. We have a Facebook Live tomorrow with Coach Elise, and she's going to be talking about, I'm so confused. I think it's Coach Elise. I'm so confused. How can I know God's plan for me so I can move forward with peace? So that would be a good segue to today's. And then tomorrow night, I'm going to be back on. Hopefully we'll get Instagram to work. And I will be on with the story of Elizabeth. What was her response to the news? Hey, Elizabeth, you're an old lady and you're going to have a baby. I know what my response would be, but let's look at what her response would be, or what her response was, and how that impacted. Again, it was different than her husband's, but the external was she got pregnant. Both of them had an internal experience, which was different. Elizabeth's experience was different than Zacharias' experience because she had different response to it. So let's tune in tomorrow, same time, and we'll see you then. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for being with me. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.